A storehouse is being filled in heaven, larger than your barns have ever been built to hold. Right now, in this very moment, as these words land in you, what you have been calling still nothing was actually still growing larger than you would dare imagine. Not the small portion you had braced yourself to accept, not the cautious yield you had begun negotiating with me for in the back of your prayers, not the slim margin of a triumph the comparison voices were sizing up for you. A scale your own arms have not yet been built to carry. Stay close for a few minutes. Across the time it takes to finish what I'm about to say, allow me to walk you through why the quiet you have been reading as no harvest has always been the noise of a yield being built, too big for the bins you have been measuring it against. And allow me to set in your hand a single line carried in my word, a line that will hush, this very hour, the doubt that your share of triumph has not yet begun. Hear the line under everything else I will tell you in these minutes. The victory was won before the battle had a name. I see you. A bushel basket in the corner of your kitchen has been the basket you have been mentally weighing your future against, and you have decided in advance that what fits inside it is what determines what I am permitted to bring. A father who has been praying for the restoration of his family keeps one cautious eye on what he believes is realistic. A young woman has shrunk her dream down to whatever size she thinks will fit through the narrow door she keeps imagining her life is walking through. A small business owner stopped asking me for the larger contract because the smaller one had begun to seem like the responsible ceiling. A grandmother has been interceding for a grandson for years, and somewhere along that praying, she lowered the request from wholly restored to at least not lost, because the smaller version felt less embarrassing to keep repeating. 2 pews over, a widow has stopped naming what she really wants, because loneliness trained her to believe wanting big is a way of getting hurt twice. Across town, a man whose career stalled 3 seasons back has narrowed his prayer to anything at all, because that feels safer than naming the actual restoration he is hungry for. Someone who survived a hard year has been thanking me only for survival, never for thriving, because thriving sounds greedy in their own ears. A teenager has filed away the louder dreams in a folder marked later, if ever, because the present feels too uncertain to hold larger ones. None of these smaller askings is invisible to me. Each shrunken request landed on my ear with the full weight of what it was originally meant to be. And I have been holding the original size in my hand on your behalf, while you have been settling for the trimmed one. Not impatient with the shrinking, tender about it. Anyone disappointed across many years learns, almost as a survival skill, to make the dream small enough that disappointment cannot fit through the same doorway twice. That is not faithlessness. That is the bruise of a heart that has loved bravely in the past and paid for it. Scold the bruise? No. Allow me to widen the doorway gently from the inside, so the bigger arrival has room to enter without crushing the part of you that grew careful for good reasons. Now breathe with me. 3 slow ones gently. Take air through the nose without forcing. Release it out the mouth a touch longer than the in. 3 is plenty. Do not perform them. By the 3rd, you will notice that the exhale has stretched on its own, with no instruction from you, because a body that has finally been declared safe will always stretch. A stretching out breath is not a technique you owe me. A stretching out breath is what occurs when a chest finally believes the scale of what is being brought to it is no longer something to brace against. Now press 1 foot flat into the carpet or floor under your seat. Sense the firm push back through your shoe. See how the ground asks nothing of you before it holds your weight. It simply receives. A receiving of that exact kind is happening underneath the size of a yield you have been afraid to hope for. Ground keeps what it was built to keep. Your nervous system does not have to manufacture a base. Base has already been laid. Lean a touch into that foot. Allow the firmness to teach the rest of you that a yield larger than your usual baskets is not a threat. It is an arrival. Hear the line once more, this time louder inside the room of your chest. The victory was won before the battle had a name. Long before the first strategy meeting in your enemy's tent. Long before the first thought of opposition formed against the life I was raising you for. Long before the day you were born. A cross was already standing in the workshop of my intention. A verdict was already settled in the courtroom of my love. What you call your battles are mop-up operations across territory I have already deeded back to you under a name no opposition gets to overrule. Settle that fact inside your ribcage. Let it become heavier than the news of the week. Heavier than the reports you keep refreshing. Heavier than the comments people leave on the work you are doing for me in quiet rooms. Heavier than the silence of the people whose approval you were not granted. The settled fact stays settled whether or not anyone in your life has begun behaving as if it were true. Shrinking your askings. That habit was not picked up on your own. Careful hands installed it across many seasons. You picked it up the first time a parent praised the modest dream and frowned at the large one. And a small filing system in your nervous system stored away the lesson that smallness is the price of approval. You picked it up in a place of worship where the prayers other people offered out loud sounded humble, in a way yours suddenly sounded greedy by comparison, even though greed had nothing to do with what your heart was actually asking for. You picked it up the season a relationship ended after you had named a larger hope and discovered in the silence afterward that naming the larger hope had somehow felt to the other person like too much weight to live next to. You picked it up the year a boss took the credit for an idea that should have lifted you, and you concluded, almost without noticing, that visibility itself is a tax you cannot afford to pay again. None of those lessons came from me. Some of the mouths that taught them loved you in their own way and were forwarding what had been spoken over them by the prior generation. Other mouths borrowed the tone of my voice on purpose to keep you small enough to be useful to them. Either origin, a falsified ceiling settled over the top of your prayers, and that ceiling has been making you mistake the lowness of the lid for the size of the room. Lift the lid off. That ceiling was never mine to begin with. Sky is the actual height above your prayers, and sky is the height of my intention for you. Somewhere along the route, you were taught that triumph was something believers earn through clenched effort, sustained perfection, and a quality of faith you have never quite been able to keep continuous for longer than a week at a stretch. You were taught that bigger wins require more pristine believers before they arrive. You were taught that a wobble in your prayer life is a deduction from the size of what would eventually come, as if heaven were running an account where every doubt got debited from the final yield. You were taught that the ones who get large blessings must have produced large righteousness, which meant the small portion you were quietly receiving was a quiet verdict on the kind of believer you suspected you were. That is not how triumph has ever worked in my kingdom. That has never been how I have given my share to anyone. A picture has been sitting inside your chest for years, earned, deserved, achieved, certified by enough endurance to silence the skeptics, and the brush that painted it was not mine. A few of those painters loved you genuinely and were repeating what they had themselves been handed by tired, fearful generations before. Other painters borrowed my name on purpose to sell you a smaller gospel that needed your striving in order to keep its lights on. Either route, a false sketch got hung on the wall of your inner room. And that sketch has been whispering for years that the size of what is coming to you depends on the size of what you can produce. Set it face down for a few minutes. Allow me to describe the actual shape of what I am bringing. A real triumph in my kingdom is the kind that does not announce itself by the volume of trumpets a believer can manufacture from the inside. A real triumph is given. It is handed across a table. The loser of an ancient war never realized he had already lost. It arrives in your kitchen on an ordinary morning, wrapped in a small mercy you almost missed. Because the bulk of the yield is being kept in a storehouse behind the kitchen, and you have not yet been invited to walk through the back door. A fragment on the counter is not the full delivery. A fragment is the receipt. The full delivery is in the storehouse, and the storehouse has your name on the lintel. You have been measuring the size of the harvest by what shows up on your counter in any given week. That is the wrong instrument. What shows up on your counter is the daily ration. The daily ration is generous, but it is not the whole yield. The whole yield is much larger than your kitchen has the cabinets to hold, and the reason it has not all been delivered at once is not that I am holding back. It is that your interior structure is still being widened to receive a delivery whose scale would overwhelm the current rooms. Each season you walk through with me, I am quietly enlarging the rooms. What looks like a slow trickle on the counter is the side effect of a much larger pour being prepared upstream. Hear how the next line came to be carried in my word. I had Paul tuck it inside the longest chapter ever penned about resurrection, a chapter delivered to a small church in a status-obsessed Greek city named Corinth, whose believers had begun comparing themselves anxiously to bigger apostles in louder cities. At the end of all that chapter's soaring teaching, he did not finish with his own accomplishments. He set down a single sentence about a win none of them had ever been required to earn. This is what I said through him. 1 Corinthians 15:57. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Sit beside me inside this sentence. Do not race through it. There is more life buried in these few words than a fast read can release. Begin with the opening phrase, but thanks be to God. Notice where the line begins. Not with a strategy you must execute. Not with a quality of faith you must summon. Not with a battlefield you must outfight. Thanks. Gratitude. A small posture of the soul that turns toward me before it turns toward the situation. The whole sentence rests on that opening posture. You have been trying to enter your triumph through effort, when the door has always been unlocked by something simpler. A bowed head, a whispered thank you, a quiet acknowledgement that the one who already won the war is the one you are leaning against. Who gives us? Read it a second time. Gives. Not sells, not rents, not leases on condition of continuous performance. Gives. A gift moves one direction across a table, and the recipient is not required to perform anything to keep it from being repossessed. Triumph in my kingdom is given the way a father gives a son the family name. A son did not earn the name. A son was born into the name. You were born into this triumph at the cross, and the gift is in your hand, whether your hand is currently strong or trembling. Us. Hear the small pronoun in the middle of the line. Not me, not them, not the spiritually advanced. Us. The whole household. The tired ones. The wobbly ones. Believers in Corinth who were comparing themselves to each other and feeling smaller for it. You, in your chair, on whichever ordinary day this video has reached you. Us includes the whole room. There is no version of us that gets the smaller portion. There is only one portion, and it has been handed out to every member of the household in equal measure. The victory. Two small words that carry more weight than every battlefield report ever written. Not a victory, not partial victories, not a series of conditional wins you can lose by Friday. The victory. A single, decisive, settled, finished outcome of the only war that ultimately mattered. The war over whether sin would have the final word. The war over whether death would have the final say. The war over whether shame would be the loudest voice in your room. All three were ended on one afternoon, 2,000 years ago. The verdict was written in blood. It has not been overturned. It will not be overturned. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, here where the gift travels. Not through your willpower, not through your bank account, not through your perfect performance of a holiness you have never quite managed. Through Him. A conduit of the entire gift is the Son who stood in your place. You do not have to invent the conduit. The conduit is already running. Your job is not to build the pipe. Your job is to drink from the water already arriving through it. And here is the quiet detail many readers miss inside this sentence. Read the verb tense again. Who gives? Present. Ongoing, right now. Not gave and finished. Not will give, once you have proven yourself enough. Gives. The handing across is happening as these words reach you. It is in motion in the room you are sitting in, not a memory, not a future event you are still waiting for. It is the daily handing across that has been arriving in fragments to your kitchen counter for years, with the full storehouse still waiting just behind the wall. There is another line I have written elsewhere in my word, through that same apostle in a different letter, about being more than conquerors through the one who has loved you. Hold that line alongside the sentence about gratitude. Your status was set in heaven before any fight was named on earth. A crown was already on the table before any chair was pulled out. The first word spoken over your life was victorious, and every contradicting voice since has been a smaller voice trying to drown out a louder one that simply will not stop speaking. Circle back for a breath to what I told you at the beginning of these words. I said, the quiet you have been reading as no harvest has always been the noise of a yield being built too big for the bins you have been measuring it against. Here is why. Because a yield that fit inside the basket you are currently holding would be a yield you could mistake for your own doing. A yield that overflows the basket, that breaks the rim, that requires a wheelbarrow, that asks the neighbors to come and help carry, is a yield no one in the room can mistake for anything other than mine. Your portion has not arrived in one tidy package because the package itself is being built larger than the rooms you've been trying to fit it into. The package is on its way. Your rooms are being widened, so the package does not have to be trimmed to enter. When this message is reaching a place inside you that had stopped asking big, drop one word into the comments, victory. Let it sit there as a small flag staked into the ground of a soul that has finally stopped negotiating me down to the size of its old disappointments. Above this video, you will find 7 brief letters held in the pinned space. One to greet each of your coming 7 mornings, dropped into your inbox the moment a small yes opens the door. Receive them. So here is something small you can take with you through the days ahead. Whenever the comparison voice arrives to shrink the size of your asking, and it will because that voice has been your roommate for years, pause and put one quiet question to it before doing anything else. What if the basket I have been using to measure my yield was never the right basket? That is the whole exercise, not a doctrine. A simple recalibration of the instrument you have been using to size your own life. One layer under that question, when you have room for it. After the asking, refuse the urge to immediately trim the dream back down to whatever felt comfortable an hour ago. Sit with the bigger possibility for one extra breath. Most of you will rush past the relief because relief on that scale is unfamiliar territory. Linger in the unfamiliar territory. Allow your shoulders to sense that my storehouse is larger than your kitchen. Allow your jaw to ease around the chance that what I have stored up for you matches the size of my love, not the size of your old disappointments. A gentler layer under that, more like a small bow than an instruction. Whenever you notice a fragment arriving on the counter, an unexpected kindness, a quiet door that opened, a problem that loosened with no effort from you, a season that tilted slightly toward you, do not write it off as luck. Whisper this back to me in whichever voice you can manage. This is the receipt, not the delivery. That single phrase is a whole posture. It trains your eye to read small mercies as previews of a much bigger arrival, instead of consuming the fragment as if it were the whole meal. Most of my deliveries arrive in receipts first. The full meal comes after the receipt has been honored. Try this once, and very little inside you may seem to budge. Try it 10 times, and the comparison voice may still feel intact. A nervous system trained for years to shrink does not relax in an afternoon. By the 30th round, however, watch for a small change. The comparison will arrive less sharply, and relief from the larger possibility will sit longer in your chest before being swept away. By the 50th round, catch yourself naming a request out loud at its original size, without first trimming it down to what feels socially acceptable. By the 100th round, glance at the inside of you and discover that you have begun asking me for the actual shape of what your heart wants, without the apology you used to staple to the front of every prayer. If a parent listening here has been quietly praying for a wayward child, but lowered the request down to, at least, let them stay alive, hear me. You do not have to keep the smaller version. Restore the original. The original was wholly restored, and the original is what I have already been working on in rooms of that child's life you cannot see. Lift the lid off the smaller prayer. Let the bigger one come out of hiding. A lifted lid does not require you to feel certain. A lifted lid only requires you to stop holding the lid down. Should your career have stalled long enough that you began trimming your professional dream down to what feels responsible, hear this. Responsibility is not a synonym for smallness. Work I have prepared for you fits the actual shape of who you are, not the trimmed shape your fear has been carving you into. Restore the original size of the work prayer. Allow me to bring the full version. The full version may take a route through doors you have not yet noticed, or doors at all. Suppose you are a widow, or a single one, whose hope of being loved has been quietly downgraded to, at least not alone forever. Hear this also. Your original hope was good. Your original hope was permitted. Your original hope is still in the air above your prayer chair, waiting for you to invite it back inside. I do not promise outcomes on a timeline of your choosing, but I do promise this. My love for you is not negotiated downward by your loneliness. Its original size is enormous. When anyone hearing this is in a body that has been ill for a long stretch, and you trimmed the healing prayer down to just less pain, because asking for full healing felt like setting yourself up to be wounded by hope again, hear me carefully. You are not required to keep the trimmed version. Lift the lid off the smaller asking, let the bigger one breathe again. Whether the full healing arrives in this life or in the next, what I have for you is whole, and the whole is the version held in the storehouse with your name on it. You do not have to know the timing in order to allow the size to be restored. Plenty has its own quiet variety of shrinking. If you are reading this from a season of abundance and suspect, the message is not for you because your counter looks full. Shrinking inside plenty is the slow forgetting that the supply was ever mine to begin with. A full basket can train an eye to stop watching the storehouse, and a full basket can train a heart to stop asking for the bigger thing because the present looks sufficient. Keep asking. The next chapter of my work in your life is not a flat continuation of this one. It is an expansion, and the expansion will reach you precisely through the door of a request you have not yet had the courage to make out loud. Should you be in a season that looks like grief, a relationship that ended, a friend who walked away, a dream that broke in your hands while you were carrying it, hear this gently. Grief is not the cancellation of the triumph I am building. Grief is the soil where what comes next has always grown best. My most generous restorations across the long history of my people have begun in rooms that looked, from outside, like rooms of loss. Do not let grief negotiate down the size of what I am bringing after it. Sorrow is honest about the cost of love. Sorrow does not, however, get to write the next chapter. That pen belongs to me, and the chapter I am writing is much larger than the loss you are inside of. Hold the loss honestly. Hold it without flinching. Hold it without pretending it is smaller than it is. And then, when you have held it long enough, allow me to bring the next thing in beside it. The next thing will not erase what was lost. The next thing will arrive as company, not replacement. The next thing is being assembled in rooms you cannot see, and it is being assembled at the size of my love for you, not at the size of your grief. There is a small picture from my word worth setting beside you here. An ancient siege. A starving city. 4 desperate men at a city gate decide death in the enemy camp could not be worse than death where they sit. They walk. They arrive. The camp is empty. A noise in the night had been mistaken by their enemy for an approaching army, and they had fled, leaving tents full of silver, food, everything an exhausted city had needed for weeks. The wind was already finished in the dark before any of the 4 ever began walking. That picture is the shape of what is unfolding in your own life right now. A camp has already been emptied. A siege has already been broken by a noise in the dark you could not hear. Your part is simply walking toward what has already been finished. An enemy you keep bracing against has heard a sound you have not heard yet. The sound of a name no opposition has ever been able to stand inside the room of. A retreat is already underway in places you cannot see. A storehouse is already filling with what you assumed was the enemy's. Walk forward. The tents are full. What was won before you ever started the walk. Take that line into the lining of your ordinary days. Tuck it inside the way someone leaves a true sentence on the doorframe on the way out. Speak it under your breath at a red light. Hum it at the kitchen counter when the comparison voice begins sizing you against the neighbor's basket. Repeat it at the doorway of the office where your boss has not yet noticed what I am doing in you. Pray it over your spouse while they sleep. Whisper it across the bedroom of the child you are watching grow. Lean on it. Not a slogan. A deed of ownership. A triumph you did not earn. A triumph you cannot lose. That triumph was settled in your favor long before any opposition learned your name. Settled. Sealed. Yours. Amen. If today's words reached a place that had stopped asking for the larger version, 7 brief letters wait inside the pinned space below. 1 to greet each of your next 7 mornings, dropped into your inbox the moment a quiet yes opens the door. Receive them. Forward this video to someone whose basket has gotten too small for the asking they were born to do. Tap subscribe so the next word reaches your feed before the comparison voice does. This was never a road any believer was meant to walk into alone.